I never thought I'd be the one to uncover a sinister secret on what was supposed to be a relaxing Caribbean cruise. But as I stood there, staring at the empty cabin next door, I knew something was terribly wrong. It all started on the third day of our 10-day voyage. My wife, Sarah, and I had splurged on this trip to celebrate our 10th anniversary. We'd saved for years, determined to go all out with a balcony suite on one of those massive floating cities they call cruise ships. The first couple of days were everything we dreamed of, lounging by the pool, indulging in endless buffets, and enjoying nightly shows. We even struck up a friendship with our next-door neighbors, a lovely retired couple named Frank and Evelyn. That's why their sudden absence was so noticeable. "Honey, have you seen Frank and Evelyn today?" I asked Sarah as we returned from breakfast on the third morning. She shook her head. Come to think of it, I didn't see them at dinner last night either. I shrugged it off, figuring they were probably just enjoying some quiet time in their cabin or had signed up for an excursion we didn't know about. But as the day wore on, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. That evening, I decided to knock on their door just to check in. No answer. I tried again the next morning. Still nothing. "Maybe we should tell someone," Sarah suggested, her brow furrowed with concern. I nodded, and we made our way to the guest services desk. The young woman behind the counter listened to our concerns with a polite smile, but I couldn't help noticing the way her eyes darted nervously to a supervisor standing nearby. "I'm sure your friends are just enjoying their vacation," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Perhaps they're at one of our many on-board activities." I pressed further, "But we haven't seen them in 2 days. Couldn't you just check to make sure they're okay?" The supervisor stepped in then, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Sir, I assure you, if there were any problems with your neighbors, we would be aware of it. We take the safety and privacy of our guests very seriously." Something about his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Sarah must have sensed it too, because she squeezed my hand and said, "Thank you for your help. We'll just keep an eye out for them." As we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Did that seem weird to you?" I asked Sarah. She nodded slowly. "Very weird. And did you notice how the supervisor jumped in? It's like they were trying to shut down the conversation." Over the next few days, we kept our eyes peeled for Frank and Evelyn, but there was no sign of them. We asked other passengers if they'd seen the couple, but no one could recall them specifically. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. Our vacation mood thoroughly dampened. Sarah and I spent more time investigating and less time relaxing. We started noticing other things too. Hushed conversations among crew members that stopped abruptly when passengers approached, security personnel patrolling the corridors more frequently than seemed necessary. On the 6th night of the cruise, unable to sleep, I slipped out of our cabin for a walk. The ship was eerily quiet, most passengers long since retired to their rooms. As I rounded a corner near the crew area, I overheard a heated conversation. "This is getting out of hand," a man's voice hissed. "That's the 3rd one this month. People are starting to ask questions." "Keep your voice down," another voice replied. "We'll handle it like we always do. No one will find out." My heart pounding, I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Before I could hear more, footsteps approached, and I hurried back to our cabin. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, my mind racing. In the morning, I told Sarah everything. "We need to do something," she said, her face pale. "What if Frank and Evelyn are in real trouble?" I nodded grimly. "I think it's time we did some real digging." Over the next 2 days, we became amateur detectives. We eavesdropped on crew conversations, befriended other passengers to gather information, and even tried to sneak into restricted areas. Most of our efforts led nowhere, but we did uncover a few disturbing facts. First, Frank and Evelyn weren't the only ones to have mysteriously vanished. We heard whispers of at least 2 other passengers who had gone missing on previous cruises. Second, the crew seemed to be under strict orders not to discuss these disappearances. And third, there was a section of the ship that seemed to be off limits even to most crew members. On the 9th night of the cruise, our last night before docking, I decided to take a risk. Using a key card I'd managed to swipe from a distracted crew member, I slipped out of our cabin after Sarah had fallen asleep. My heart was pounding as I made my way to the restricted area. The key card worked, and I found myself in a dimly lit corridor I'd never seen before. The air was cooler here, with a faint metallic smell that made me uneasy. As I crept down the hallway, I heard muffled sounds coming from behind one of the doors. Gathering my courage, I pressed my ear against it. "Please," a weak voice pleaded. "Please let us go." My blood ran cold. I recognized that voice. It was Evelyn. Before I could process what I'd heard, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around to find myself face to face with the supervisor from guest services, flanked by 2 large security guards. "I'm afraid you've wandered into a restricted area, sir," he said, his voice icy. "We'll have to ask you to come with us." The next few hours were a blur. I was taken to a small, windowless room and questioned for what felt like an eternity. They wanted to know what I'd heard, what I suspected, who I'd told. I tried to play dumb, to protect Sarah, but I'm not sure how convincing I was. Eventually, they let me go, but not before delivering a chilling warning. "Mr. Thompson," the supervisor said, using my name for the first time, "I want you to understand something. What happens on this ship stays on this ship. If you or your wife breathe a word of this to anyone, there will be consequences. Severe consequences. Do I make myself clear?" I nodded numbly, my mind reeling. When I finally made it back to our cabin, I found Sarah awake and frantic with worry. "Where have you been?" she cried, throwing her arms around me. "I woke up and you were gone, and after everything that's happened, I thought." I held her tight, my whole body shaking. "We need to get off this ship," I whispered. "As soon as we dock, we need to go straight to the police." The next morning, as we pulled into port, Sarah and I were among the first off the ship. We went directly to the local police station, where we spent hours giving statements and explaining everything we'd seen and heard. At first, the officers seemed skeptical, but as they made some calls and did some digging of their own, their demeanor changed. By the end of the day, we saw police cars and ambulances racing toward the port. In the weeks that followed, the story unfolded like a nightmare. It turned out the cruise line had been covering up disappearances for years. Some passengers had been robbed and murdered by a ring of corrupt crew members. Others, like Frank and Evelyn, had been kidnapped and were being held for ransom. The cruise line's top executives were implicated in the cover-up. Arrests were made, lawsuits were filed, and the story made international headlines. Sarah and I were hailed as heroes for breaking the case open, but it didn't feel like a victory. We couldn't stop thinking about all the people who had suffered, all the families who had lost loved ones. It's been a year since that fateful cruise, and I still have nightmares about it. Sarah and I have become advocates for cruise ship safety, working with victims, families to push for stronger regulations and oversight. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't noticed Frank and Evelyn's absence, if we hadn't pushed for answers. How many more people would have vanished without a trace? I used to love the idea of being out on the open sea, of escaping the world on a floating paradise. Now, I know that sometimes paradise can hide the darkest secrets. And in the vastness of the ocean, it's all too easy for people to disappear. The ship groaned and shuddered beneath my feet as the massive wave struck. In that moment of darkness, as the power failed and the world tilted sideways, I realized our luxury cruise had just become a fight for survival. I'd always dreamed of taking a cruise through the South Pacific. The allure of crystal-clear waters, pristine beaches, and the promise of ultimate relaxation had finally convinced my wife, Emily, to book this trip for our 15th anniversary. Little did we know that our dream vacation would turn into a nightmare. The first few days were nothing short of paradise. We lounged by the pool, sipping colorful cocktails and marveling at how the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. At night, We danced under the stars, caught up in the magic of being so far from the worries of our everyday lives. On the fourth day, things began to change. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, warning of an approaching storm system. Nothing to worry about, he assured us, his tone jovial. Just a bit of rough weather. We'll skirt around the worst of it. Emily and I exchanged glances but shrugged it off. After all, this massive ship had weathered countless storms. What could possibly go wrong? As the day progressed, the sky darkened ominously. The once gentle rocking of the ship became more pronounced, and fewer passengers ventured out onto the open decks. By evening, rain lashed against the windows of the main dining room as we ate our dinner. Maybe we should head back to the cabin, Emily suggested, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth as another violent tremor shook the ship. I nodded, trying to hide my growing unease. Probably a good idea. We can watch a movie or something until this blows over. We made our way through the corridors, gripping the handrails as the ship pitched and rolled. Other passengers stumbled past us, their faces pale and drawn. The festive atmosphere of the previous days had evaporated, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the howling wind and the creaking of the ship's hull. Safe in our cabin, we changed into comfortable clothes and settled onto the bed. I flipped through the TV channels, looking for a distraction, while Emily peered anxiously out the porthole. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at that." I joined her at the window, and my breath caught in my throat. In the darkness beyond, illuminated by flashes of lightning, I could see waves the size of buildings rolling towards us. The ship, which had seemed so massive and invincible when we boarded, now felt terrifyingly small. Suddenly, a voice boomed over the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some extreme weather conditions. For your safety, please remain in your cabins and..." His words were cut off as the biggest wave I'd ever seen slammed into the side of the ship. The lights flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. I felt the floor tilt sharply, and Emily screamed as we both tumbled across the room. For a few terrifying seconds, all I could hear was the roar of water and the groaning of metal. Then, mercifully, emergency lights sputtered to life, casting an eerie red glow throughout the cabin. "Are you okay?" I called out, my heart pounding. "I think so," Emily replied, her voice shaky. "What's happening?" Before I could answer, the intercom crackled again. This time, the captain's voice was tense, all pretense of calm professionalism gone. "This is an emergency. The ship has sustained damage and is taking on water. All passengers, please proceed calmly to your designated muster stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The reality of our situation hit me like a physical blow. This massive cruise ship, our floating luxury hotel, was sinking. "We need to move," I said, grabbing our life jackets from the closet. Now, as we stepped into the hallway, we were met with a scene of chaos. Passengers spilled out of their cabins, some crying, others shouting for loved ones. The ship lurched again, and I had to brace myself against the wall to stay upright. "Remember the drill," I told Emily, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to get to muster station C on deck 4. We pushed our way through the panicked crowd, the red emergency lights casting strange shadows that made everything seem surreal. The trek to deck 4, usually a quick elevator ride, now felt like a journey through hell. Stairs were crowded with people, some frozen in fear, others shoving their way down. When we finally reached muster station C, it was a scene of barely controlled chaos. Crew members in life vests were trying to organize passengers, but their voices were nearly drowned out by the storm and the frightened crowd. "Listen up," a crew member shouted. "We're going to begin loading the lifeboats. Please remain calm and follow our instructions." Calm? How could anyone be calm? I could feel the ship listing more severely now, and there was an ominous creaking sound coming from somewhere below us. As we waited for our turn to board a lifeboat, I overheard snippets of conversation around us. Someone mentioned a huge hole torn in the ship's hull. Another person swore they'd seen water pouring into the lower decks. Emily squeezed my hand, her eyes wide with fear. "James, are we going to die?" I pulled her close, wishing I could promise her that everything would be okay. But the truth was, I had no idea if we'd make it through this. "We're going to do everything we can to survive," I said instead. "Just stay close to me." The next hour was a blur of terror and adrenaline. Loading the lifeboats in the midst of the storm was a nightmare. Waves crashed over the deck, threatening to sweep people into the raging sea. The wind was so strong it nearly ripped the life jacket from my body. When it was finally our turn, I helped Emily into the swaying lifeboat, then climbed in after her. As we were lowered into the churning ocean, I caught a last glimpse of the cruise ship. It was tilting badly now, the once gleaming white hull scarred and battered. Our little lifeboat was tossed about like a toy in a bathtub as we struggled to move away from the sinking ship. The storm raged on, rain lashing our faces, waves threatening to capsize us at any moment. In the distance, I could see other lifeboats, small orange dots bobbing in the vast, angry sea. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. Our group of survivors huddled together, cold, wet, and terrified, watching as a massive cruise ship slipped beneath the waves. The enormity of what had happened began to sink in. We were alive, but stranded in the middle of the ocean with limited supplies and no idea when help might arrive. Hours passed. Some people prayed. Others wept quietly. I held Emily close, trying to share what little warmth I had. We rationed out water and emergency rations, all too aware that we might be out here for days. It was nearly sunset when we heard it. The distant thrum of engines. A cheer went up as we spotted a ship on the horizon. Then another. Rescue was coming. As a Coast Guard vessel pulled alongside our lifeboat, I felt a wave of relief, so intense it left me dizzy. We were going to survive this. The aftermath of the disaster was a whirlwind of debriefings, medical checkups, and interviews with authorities and media. We learned that while most passengers and crew had been rescued, some hadn't been as lucky. The image of those poor souls would haunt me for years to come. Investigations revealed that the ship had indeed been struck by a rogue wave, a rare, enormous wave that seems to appear out of nowhere. The impact had torn a massive hole in the hull, and the ship's pumps simply couldn't keep up with the influx of water. In the months that followed, Emily and I struggled with nightmares and anxiety. The sound of rain on our roof could send us into a panic. But slowly, with time and therapy, we began to heal. We never took another cruise. The allure of the open ocean had been forever tainted by our brush with death. But our experience gave us a new appreciation for life, for each other, and for the raw, untamed power of nature. Now, years later, when I look out at the sea, I'm reminded of both its beauty and its danger. I think of that night, of the thin line between life and death, and I'm grateful for every moment I have on solid ground. The cough started small, barely noticeable among the laughter and chatter of the cruise ship's bustling dining room. But as I watched the man at the next table collapse, his face turning an alarming shade of blue, I realized our vacation paradise was about to become a floating nightmare. I never thought I'd find myself trapped on a cruise ship in the middle of a pandemic. My wife, Lisa, and I had been planning this trip for months, a 2-week Caribbean cruise to celebrate our retirement. We'd saved for years, looking forward to lazy days by the pool, exotic port excursions, and evenings filled with entertainment and fine dining. The first few days were everything we dreamed of. We explored the massive ship, marveling at its numerous restaurants, theaters, and activities. We made new friends, sharing meals and swapping stories with couples from all over the world. The biggest worry on our minds was whether to try the rock climbing wall or sign up for a cooking class. It was on the 4th day that things began to change. At breakfast, I noticed a man a few tables over coughing incessantly. His wife kept shooting him concerned glances, but he waved off her worries between hacking fits. Probably just a cold, Lisa said when I mentioned it. You know how germs spread on these ships. I nodded, trying to push away the unease settling in my stomach. We went about our day, lounging by the pool and taking in a matinee show. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There seemed to be more people coughing, and I swore I saw a few passengers wearing face masks. That evening, as we dressed for dinner, the captain's voice came over the intercom. His tone was serious, lacking the usual cheerful lilt. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've had reports of several passengers falling ill with flu-like symptoms. As a precautionary measure, we ask that anyone feeling unwell please return to their cabins and contact the medical center immediately. Thank you for your cooperation. Lisa and I exchanged worried glances. Maybe we should skip dinner, she suggested. Eat in the room tonight. I agreed, and we ordered room service. As we ate, we flipped through news channels, searching for any information about outbreaks on cruise ships. There was nothing specific, but reports of a new, highly contagious virus were starting to make headlines. The next morning, the atmosphere on the ship had changed dramatically. The usual buzz of activity was muted, replaced by an undercurrent of anxiety. More people wore masks now, and I noticed crew members disinfecting surfaces with an almost frantic energy. We decided to attend the captain's daily briefing, hoping for reassurance. Instead, what we heard chilled us to the bone. As some of you may have noticed, we're dealing with a health situation on board. The captain began, his face grim. We've identified several cases of a severe respiratory illness. Our medical team is working hard to contain the spread, but as a precaution, we've been denied entry to our next scheduled port. A murmur of alarm rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Are we quarantined?" The captain hesitated before answering. At this time, we're in communication with maritime authorities to determine the best course of action. For now, I ask everyone to remain calm and follow all health and safety protocols. As we left the briefing, Lisa gripped my arm tightly. "John, I'm scared," she whispered. "What if we can't get off the ship?" I wished I had a reassuring answer, but the truth was, I was terrified too. Over the next few days, the situation deteriorated rapidly. More and more passengers fell ill, overwhelming the ship's medical facilities. The crew converted one of the main dining rooms into a makeshift hospital ward. The sound of coughing echoed through the corridors, and the once lively atmosphere was replaced by a tense, fearful silence. We were turned away from port after port, each country refusing to risk exposure to the mysterious illness. Supplies began to run low. Fresh fruit and vegetables disappeared from the menu, replaced by canned goods and dry staples. Lisa and I spent most of our time in our cabin, venturing out only when necessary. We watched movies, played cards, and tried to distract ourselves from the nightmare unfolding around us. But it was impossible to ignore the announcements of new cases, the sound of ambulance boats arriving to evacuate the most critical patients. A week into our ordeal, Lisa developed a fever. My heart raced as I called the medical center, only to be told they were overwhelmed and could only see the most severe cases. "Just keep her hydrated and monitor her symptoms," the harried nurse advised. "If she has trouble breathing, call us immediately." I spent the next 48 hours in a state of constant anxiety, watching Lisa like a hawk for any sign her condition was worsening. I rationed our bottled water, knowing supplies were running low. When her fever finally broke, I wept with relief. As we entered the second week of quarantine, the ship became a powder keg of fear and frustration. Some passengers defied orders to stay in their cabins, roaming the decks in protest. Fights broke out in the lines for ration supplies. Through it all, the crew worked tirelessly, trying to maintain order and care for the sick with dwindling resources. News from the outside world was sporadic and often contradictory. We heard rumors of other ships in similar situations, of countries closing their borders, of a global pandemic unfolding. Our families sent frantic messages, begging for updates and assurances of our safety that we couldn't honestly give. It was day 16. though it felt like we'd been trapped for months, when we finally received some good news. A country had agreed to allow us to dock, with strict quarantine protocols in place. As we approached the port, I stood on our balcony, watching the shoreline grow closer. The sight of land, of other human beings waiting to help us, brought tears to my eyes. Disembarking was a surreal experience. We walked through a gauntlet of health workers in full protective gear, underwent a battery of tests, and were shuttled to a quarantine facility. But even the stark hospital room felt like luxury after our ordeal at sea. In the days that followed, as we waited for test results and clearance to return home, Lisa and I had time to reflect on our experience. We'd witnessed humanity at its worst, panicked, selfish, and cruel. But we'd also seen incredible acts of kindness and bravery, from crew members who risked their own health to care for sick passengers, to strangers who shared dwindling supplies with their neighbors. We'd gone on this cruise expecting a carefree vacation and found ourselves instead in the middle of a historic crisis. The experience had changed us, making us acutely aware of our vulnerability and the interconnectedness of our world. When we were finally allowed to fly home, the world we returned to was dramatically different from the one we'd left. The pandemic had spread globally, shutting down entire countries. Our quiet retirement turned into a time of isolation and worry for loved ones. Sometimes, in the dark of night, I still find myself back on that ship, feeling the gentle sway beneath my feet, hearing the distant sound of coughing. The experience left scars that may never fully heal. But it also gave us a new appreciation for the simple things: health, safety, the comfort of home. We emerged from our ordeal with a deeper understanding of human resilience and the importance of compassion in times of crisis. Now, as the world slowly recovers, Lisa and I often talk about traveling again. We probably won't ever set foot on another cruise ship, but we haven't lost our desire to explore and connect with others. If anything, our experience has reinforced the value of human connection, even as it taught us the risks that can come with it. Our retirement may not have started the way we planned, but we're grateful for every day, every breath. And we carry with us the lessons learned during those harrowing weeks at sea. Lessons about survival, about humanity, and about the strength we can find within ourselves when faced with the unimaginable. The moment I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. The cabin was pitch black, but I could sense a presence, someone who didn't belong. As I lay there, heart pounding, I heard the unmistakable sound of rummaging coming from the direction of my suitcase. I'd always been a light sleeper, which is probably why I woke up in the first place. This was supposed to be a relaxing solo cruise, a chance to recharge after a grueling year at work. I'd saved up for months to afford this little luxury, dreaming of sun-soaked days and peaceful nights. The first 2 days had been everything I'd hoped for. I lounged by the pool, chatted with friendly strangers at the bar, and even tried my hand at salsa dancing. As I settled into bed that second night, I felt more relaxed than I had in years. Now, lying frozen in the darkness, that peace shattered like glass. My mind raced. Should I confront the intruder? Call for help? I was on the 8th deck, too high to risk climbing out the window. The balcony door was locked. I checked it twice before bed, a habit from years of living in the city. Another rustle, closer this time. I forced my breathing to remain slow and even, feigning sleep. Through barely open eyes, I could make out a shadowy figure moving about the room. It was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. Here I was, trapped in a floating hotel room with a stranger who had somehow gained entry. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd chosen a cruise partly because I thought it would be safer than staying in various hotels. The intruder moved again, and a sliver of light from the hallway illuminated their profile as they passed the door. It was a man, tall and wiry, dressed all in black. My pulse quickened. This wasn't some drunk passenger who'd stumbled into the wrong cabin. This was deliberate. I ran through my options. My phone was on the nightstand, tantalizingly close but impossible to reach without alerting the intruder. The cabin's phone was on the desk across the room. I could try to make a run for the door, but what if he caught me? The man muttered something under his breath, sounding frustrated. What was he looking for? I'd brought some nice clothes and my laptop, but nothing particularly valuable. Then it hit me. My passport and wallet were in the safe. As if reading my thoughts, the intruder moved towards the closet where the safe was hidden. I heard the beep of buttons being pressed. How did he know the code? A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. This wasn't random. He'd been watching me, waiting for his chance. I knew I had to do something. Once he opened the safe, he'd have what he came for and might decide to ensure there were no witnesses. Taking a deep breath, I made my decision. In one fluid motion, I launched myself out of bed towards the door. The sudden movement and noise startled the intruder. He whirled around, but I was already halfway across the room. My fingers fumbled with the lock, precious seconds ticking by. I could hear him coming up behind me, just as his hand grabbed my shoulder. The door flew open. I tumbled into the hallway, screaming at the top of my lungs. Help! Intruder! Someone, please help! Doors began to open along the corridor. The man hesitated for a split second, then took off running in the opposite direction. A couple emerged from their cabin, the man immediately giving chase while his wife came to my aid. Are you all right? She asked, helping me to my feet. I nodded, still shaking. Within minutes, the hallway was chaos. Security guards rushed past, radios crackling. Fellow passengers gathered, murmuring in concern. I found myself wrapped in a blanket, trying to give a coherent statement to a ship's officer. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I'd been seconds away from... What? Robbery? Assault? Worse? The thought made me nauseous. The next few hours passed in a blur. I was moved to a new cabin while security swept my old room for evidence. They took my statement multiple times, photographed the few things the intruder had touched, and assured me they were doing everything possible to catch him. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. I stood on the balcony of my new cabin, watching the sun rise over the ocean. It should have been beautiful, but all I felt was a deep, gnawing anxiety. How had he gotten into my room? The lock hadn't been forced. Did he have a master key? Was it someone who worked on the ship? The thought made me shudder. If I couldn't trust the staff, how could I feel safe anywhere on board? As the day progressed, rumors spread like wildfire. Passengers gathered in small groups, swapping theories and concerns. I overheard snippets of conversation, whispers of other thefts, speculation about inside jobs, debates about the ship's security measures. The cruise director called an emergency meeting in the main theater. He assured us that security had been heightened and that they were working closely with authorities at our next port of call to apprehend the suspect. But his words rang hollow. The damage was done. The carefree atmosphere of the cruise had been shattered, replaced by an undercurrent of suspicion and fear. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every unexpected sound. The staff were sympathetic, offering free drinks and spa treatments to help me relax. But nothing could erase the memory of that shadowy figure in my room. As night fell, I found myself unable to face going back to my cabin. Instead, I wandered the ship, gravitating towards well-lit, populated areas. I ended up in one of the lounges, nursing a drink and watching other passengers enjoy what was supposed to be a vacation. A woman about my age approached, hesitating before speaking. I don't mean to intrude, but are you the one from last night? The one who had the break-in? I nodded, bracing myself for more questions. But instead, she sat down and introduced herself as Karen. I can't imagine how scary that must have been, she said softly. Are you okay? Something about her gentle concern broke through the numbness I'd been feeling all day. Before I knew it, I was pouring out the whole story. Not just the facts I'd given security, but how it had felt, the terror and helplessness of those moments. Karen listened without judgment, offering quiet support. As I talked, I felt some of the tension begin to ease. Here was someone who understood, who wasn't just looking for gossip or trying to minimize what had happened. We ended up talking for hours. Karen shared her own story of a home invasion years ago, how it had left her feeling vulnerable and afraid in her own space. She talked about how she'd worked through that trauma, finding ways to reclaim her sense of safety. As the lounge emptied out around us, Karen made a suggestion. Listen, I know we just met, but if you're not comfortable sleeping alone, you're welcome to crash on my sofa. My cabin mate won't mind. The offer brought tears to my eyes. This stranger's kindness was like a lifeline in the storm of emotions I'd been weathering. I accepted gratefully, and for the first time since the incident, I slept without nightmares. The rest of the cruise was a mix of highs and lows. Security never did catch the intruder, though they assured us he was no longer on board. I struggled with anxiety, especially at night, but I also found unexpected connections with fellow passengers who rallied around me. Karen and I became fast friends, along with a small group of others who'd heard what happened. They accompanied me to meals, joined me for activities, and helped me find moments of joy despite everything. By the time we docked at our final port, I had a decision to make. The cruise line had offered me a full refund and a free future cruise to make up for the incident. Part of me wanted to swear off cruising forever, to retreat to the safety of home. But as I said goodbye to my new friends, exchanging promises to keep in touch, I realized something. Yes, something terrible had happened, but in its wake, I'd experienced incredible kindness and formed connections I never would have otherwise. The world could be a dangerous place, on land or at sea, but it was also full of good people, of unexpected moments of beauty and human connection. As I disembarked, I felt different. Shaken, yes, but also stronger. I'd faced one of my worst fears and come out the other side. And while I knew the memory would stay with me, I refused to let it define my future. I took one last look at the ship that had been the site of both terror and unexpected friendship. Then, squaring my shoulders, I stepped onto solid ground, ready to face whatever came next. I never expected to find a man living in our cruise ship closet, but there he was, crouched among our hanging clothes, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. In that moment, our carefree family vacation turned into a moral dilemma that would haunt us long after we returned to shore. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. My wife, Sarah, our two kids, Emma, 14, and Ethan, 10, and I had saved for years to afford this luxury cruise through the Mediterranean. We'd boarded the massive ship with wide-eyed wonder, marveling at the endless amenities and the promise of adventure in each port. The first few days were magical. We lounged by the pool, indulged in gourmet meals, and enjoyed nightly entertainment that left us breathless. Emma made friends with some kids her age, while Ethan couldn't get enough of the onboard water park. Sarah and I even managed to sneak away for a couple's massage, feeling the stress of our everyday lives melt away. It was on the fourth night of our cruise that everything changed. We had just returned from a formal dinner, the kids giddy from too much dessert and the late hour. As we got ready for bed, Emma opened the closet to hang up her dress. Her scream pierced the cabin. I rushed over, expecting to find a spider or maybe a mouse. Instead, I found myself face to face with a man who looked as terrified as we felt. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with olive skin and dark, haunted eyes. His clothes were dirty and rumpled, and he had the gaunt look of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. "Please," he whispered in heavily accented English. "Please help me." Sarah had pulled the kids behind her, her face pale with shock. "John," she said, her voice shaking. "What do we do?" It was a question I didn't have an answer to. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. How long had he been in there? How had he gotten into our cabin? Was he dangerous? "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I need you to come out of there slowly. We're going to call security and—" "No," he pleaded, shrinking further back into the closet. "Please, no security. They will send me back." I will die if I go back. The desperation in his voice gave me pause. I looked at Sarah, seeing my own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. "Kids," she said softly, "go into the bathroom and lock the door." Now, Emma and Ethan, unusually compliant, did as they were told. Once the bathroom door clicked shut, Sarah turned back to the man in our closet. "Who are you?" she asked. "And why are you hiding in our room?" Slowly, cautiously, the man emerged from the closet. He was even thinner than I'd first thought, his cheekbones sharp under his skin. "My name is Yusuf," he said. "I am from Syria. I stowed away on this ship. It was the only way I could think to escape." Over the next hour, Yusuf told us his story. He'd fled the ongoing conflict in Syria, making his way to Turkey with hopes of reaching Europe. But with borders tightening and refugees being turned away, he'd grown desperate. When the cruise ship docked in Istanbul, he'd seen an opportunity. "I snuck on board with the loading crew," he explained. "I've been hiding in storage areas, sneaking food when I could, but it became too risky. I needed a safer place to hide, just until we reach Italy. Please, I beg you, don't turn me in." Sarah and I exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between us. We were just a normal family from the suburbs. What were we supposed to do with a stowaway refugee? "We need to think about this," I finally said. You can stay here for tonight, but we'll have to figure something out in the morning." Relief washed over Yusuf's face. "Thank you," he said, his eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you so much." We made a makeshift bed for him on the floor, using extra blankets and pillows. Then we retrieved Emma and Ethan from the bathroom, trying our best to explain the situation in terms they could understand. That night, none of us slept much. I lay awake, listening to the gentle snores of my family and the occasional rustle as Yusuf shifted on his blanket. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. On one hand, I felt sympathy for Yusuf. I couldn't imagine the desperation that would drive someone to such lengths. The father in me wanted to protect him, to help him find safety. But another part of me was afraid. What if he was dangerous? What if we got caught harboring him? We could be arrested or at the very least kicked off the cruise. Our perfect family vacation would be ruined, and we might face legal consequences back home. As dawn broke, we faced a decision. Do we turn Yusuf in, potentially sending him back to a dangerous situation? Or do we risk everything to help him? We spent the morning talking it through as a family, including Emma and Ethan in the discussion. To my surprise, the kids were firmly in favor of helping Yusuf. "It's the right thing to do, Dad," Emma said, showing a maturity beyond her years. "We can't just send him back when he's trying to find a better life." Ethan nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and he seems nice. Not scary at all." Sarah squeezed my hand. "I think we need to help him," she said softly. I couldn't live with myself if we didn't try. And so, our family vacation turned into an elaborate operation to hide and care for a stowaway. We smuggled food back to the cabin, shared our clothes with Yusuf, and took turns keeping watch for any suspicious crew members. It wasn't easy. We had to cancel some of our planned excursions, making excuses about seasickness. The close quarters were stressful, and there were moments of tension and fear. Every knock on the door sent our hearts racing. But as the days passed, we got to know Yusuf better. He told us about his life in Syria, about the family he left behind, and his dreams for the future. He was kind and gentle with the kids, teaching them Arabic words and telling them stories from his childhood. We learned that he had been a medical student before the war disrupted his life. He spoke passionately about his desire to finish his studies and become a doctor, to help others the way we were helping him. As we approached the Italian coast, the reality of what we were doing began to sink in. We were about to smuggle a person into a foreign country. The potential consequences were terrifying. The night before we were set to dock, I sat out on our tiny balcony with Yusuf. The Mediterranean stretched out before us, dark and mysterious under the starry sky. "Are you sure about this?" I asked him. "Once we dock, There's no turning back. If you're caught. Yusuf was quiet for a long moment. I am afraid, he admitted, but I have no choice. To go back is to die, either quickly by bomb or slowly by despair. At least this way, I have a chance at life. His words stayed with me as we put our plan into action the next day. We decided to smuggle Yusuf off the ship inside our largest suitcase. It was risky, but we hoped that as a family with young kids, we'd be less likely to face intense scrutiny. Those moments passing through customs were the most stressful of my life. Every second felt like an hour, every casual glance from an official like an accusation. But somehow, miraculously, we made it through. In a quiet corner of the port, we opened the suitcase. Yusuf emerged, disoriented but alive. The relief on his face was indescribable. I can never repay you for what you've done, he said, embracing each of us in turn. You've given me a chance at life. We'd arranged to meet with a contact from a refugee aid organization, someone who could help Yusuf navigate the asylum process. As we said our goodbyes, I felt a complex mix of emotions, relief, fear, sadness, and a profound sense that we'd done something important. Watching Yusuf walk away with the aid worker, I pulled my family close. Our vacation hadn't gone as planned, but we'd experienced something far more valuable than sightseeing and suntanning. We'd looked into the face of human suffering and chosen compassion over comfort, courage over complacency. As we made our way to the hotel, already dreading the questions we'd face back home, Emma looked up at me. "Dad," she said, "I think this was the best trip ever." And despite everything, I found myself agreeing. We'd set out to make memories, and we'd ended up making a difference. It wasn't the carefree vacation we'd planned, but it was an experience that would shape our family forever.